In the autumn of 1274, the seas around Japan churned with a sight that had never before graced these waters. Hundreds upon hundreds of ships stretched across the horizon, their dark sails blotting out the morning sun like storm clouds gathering for war. At the head of this armada flew the banners of the most powerful empire the world had ever known, the Mongol Empire of Kublai Khan. These were not mere raiders or pirates seeking quick plunder. This was conquest incarnate, a military machine that had already devoured China, Korea, and half the known world, now setting its hungry gaze upon the island kingdom of Japan. But something extraordinary was about to happen, something that would shatter the myth of Mongol invincibility and forge a legend that would echo through 8 centuries of history. This is the story of how a seemingly unstoppable force met not just immovable resistance, but the very wrath of nature itself. 2 massive invasions, 7 years apart, each larger and more determined than the last, would crash against Japanese shores like waves against stone. Yet when the storms cleared and the smoke settled, it would be the Mongols limping home in defeat, their dreams of empire broken on the beaches of Kyushu. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic confrontations between East and West, between the largest land empire ever assembled and a collection of warrior islands that refused to bow. What followed would change both civilizations forever, creating legends of divine winds and samurai valor that continue to captivate us today. This is not just the tale of military campaigns and tactical brilliance. This is the story of how geography, weather, culture, and sheer human determination combined to halt the Mongol war machine at the edge of the world. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold, we must first grasp the sheer scope of Mongol ambition in the 13th century. Kublai Khan was not merely another conqueror seeking glory. He was the grandson of Genghis Khan, inheritor of the largest contiguous empire in human history. From the steppes of Mongolia to the rice fields of southern China, from the mountains of Tibet to the Korean peninsula, the Mongol banner flew supreme. Every kingdom that had dared resist had been crushed. Every army that had stood against them had been scattered to the winds. Yet Japan remained tantalizingly out of reach, protected by treacherous seas that had never known the passage of a conquering army. The Japanese had watched from their island fortress as kingdom after kingdom fell to Mongol might. They had received Khan's demands for submission, written in the flowery language of diplomacy but carrying the unmistakable threat of annihilation. The message was clear: submit or be destroyed. But Japan's response was silence, a silence that spoke louder than any declaration of war. The Mongols had conquered through a combination of superior organization, innovative tactics, and psychological warfare that broke enemy morale before the first arrow was loosed. Their armies moved like clockwork, each unit knowing its role, each commander understanding the grand strategy. They employed Chinese engineers who built siege engines capable of reducing the mightiest fortress to rubble. They used Korean shipwrights whose vessels could navigate rivers and coastal waters with equal ease. Most importantly, they wielded a weapon that few of their enemies had ever encountered: gunpowder. For Japan, the approaching storm represented more than a military threat. It was a challenge to everything they understood about warfare, honor, and their place in the world. The samurai who would soon face these invaders were products of a unique warrior culture, one that prized individual combat over mass tactics, honor over victory, and death over dishonor. Their entire military system was built around the concept of single combat between mounted warriors, each seeking personal glory through acts of individual heroism. These warriors had been forged in the crucible of centuries of internal conflict. The Genpei War, which had ended just a century earlier, had seen samurai clans battle for control of Japan in conflicts that were as much about personal honor as political power. Victory went to the brave, the skilled, and the honorable. Battles began with formal challenges, warriors announcing their names and lineages before engaging in single combat while armies watched from the sidelines. But the Mongols cared nothing for honor or individual glory. They fought to win, using whatever tactics would bring victory most efficiently. Their armies moved in coordinated formations, each soldier a cog in a vast machine of war. They employed massed archery volleys, coordinated cavalry charges, and siege weapons that could break castle walls from distances that Japanese defenders had never imagined possible. Most terrifying of all, they used explosive devices, weapons that seemed to harness the very thunder of heaven itself. The first hints of this technological revolution came with early Mongol raids on outlying islands. Reports filtered back to the Japanese mainland of weapons that exploded like thunder, creating flashes of light and clouds of acrid smoke. Horses, the pride of samurai warfare, were driven mad by the noise and concussion. Warriors who had faced sword and spear without flinching found themselves paralyzed by terror at these supernatural-seeming devices. As the first Mongol fleet approached Japanese waters in 1274, it carried with it not just soldiers and supplies, but an entirely different conception of warfare. The invasion force numbered somewhere between 30 and 40,000 men, a vast army by the standards of the time. But numbers alone do not tell the full story. These were not the undisciplined hordes of barbarian stereotype, but professional soldiers drawn from across the Mongol Empire. Chinese engineers operated the siege engines and explosive devices. Korean sailors navigated the ships through treacherous coastal waters. Mongol officers provided leadership and tactical coordination that had proven unbeatable on land. The fleet itself was a marvel of medieval logistics. Hundreds of ships of various sizes, from massive transports carrying siege engines and cavalry mounts to swift warships bristling with archers and marines. Supply vessels loaded with food, weapons, and ammunition followed in the wake of the fighting ships. This was not a raid or a quick strike, but a full-scale invasion designed to conquer and hold Japanese territory. Yet for all their preparation and overwhelming advantages, the Mongols were about to discover that Japan would not be another China or Korea. The samurai waiting on the beaches of Kyushu were ready to fight with a desperation born of defending their homeland. Behind them lay not just their lord's domain, but their families, their ancestors' graves, and everything that gave their lives meaning. They might be outnumbered, outgunned, and facing tactics they had never encountered, but they possessed something that no amount of military superiority could easily overcome: the absolute determination of men fighting for their very existence. The collision between these two military cultures would produce some of the most dramatic battles in medieval history. Mongol discipline and technology would clash with samurai courage and adaptability. The narrow beaches and difficult terrain of Japan would neutralize many Mongol advantages while favoring defenders who knew every hill and stream. And looming over everything would be the unpredictable power of nature itself, the typhoons that would earn the name Kamikaze, divine wind, and become legend. The invasion began with methodical precision that had become the hallmark of Mongol warfare. First came the outlying islands of Tsushima and Iki, stepping stones that would secure the sea lanes and provide bases for the final assault on Kyushu itself. The defenders of these remote outposts knew they were doomed, yet they fought with the ferocity of cornered wolves, buying precious time with their blood, while messengers raced across the waters to warn the mainland of what was coming. On Tsushima, the local garrison was overwhelmed within hours, but not before they had demonstrated the terrible cost the invaders would pay for every inch of Japanese soil. The Mongol commanders, accustomed to enemies who fled or surrendered when faced with superior numbers, found themselves dealing with defenders who fought to the last man, who preferred death to dishonor, and who turned every building into a fortress and every street into a killing ground. The psychological impact of these early encounters worked both ways. Japanese messengers brought terrifying reports of the enemy's capabilities. They spoke of weapons that roared like dragons and spat fire, of arrows that flew in clouds so thick they darkened the sky, of warriors who fought in perfect coordination as if controlled by a single mind. But they also carried word of something else, something that gave hope to the defenders preparing for the main assault. The invaders, for all their fearsome reputation, could bleed and die like any other men. When the main Mongol fleet finally appeared off the coast of Hakata Bay in November 1274, it presented a sight that none of the Japanese defenders would ever forget. Ship after ship stretched beyond the horizon, their masts forming a forest of wood and canvas that seemed to cover the entire sea. The sound of their approach, the creaking of timber, the splash of countless oars, and the shouts of men in foreign tongues carried across the water like the growl of some vast sea monster preparing to devour the land. The samurai who gathered on the beaches to meet them were a sight to behold in their own right. Clad in layers of lacquered armor that gleamed like beetle shells, mounted on horses bred for war, they carried weapons that had been passed down through generations of warriors. Their Yumi longbows, crafted with the precision of works of art, could send an arrow through armor at distances that amazed even experienced Mongol archers. Their swords, the legendary blades that would one day be known as katana, were razor-sharp instruments of death forged by master smiths who treated their craft as a sacred art. Yet, as impressive as individual samurai warriors might be, they were about to face a military system that operated on entirely different principles. Where Japanese warfare emphasized personal skill and individual heroics, Mongol tactics relied on mass coordination and overwhelming firepower. The contrast became apparent the moment the first landing craft touched the beaches. Samurai tradition demanded that battles begin with formal challenges, individual warriors riding forward to announce their names, their ancestry, and their achievements before engaging in single combat. But when Japanese champions galloped toward the Mongol lines, calling out their challenges in voices that rang across the beach, they were met, not with answering challenges, but with coordinated volleys of arrows that cut them down before they could close to sword range. The Mongols fought as units, moving in formation, supporting each other with disciplined precision. When samurai charged, expecting to engage individual opponents, they found themselves surrounded by groups of enemy soldiers who showed no interest in honorable single combat. Mongol archers, protected by shields and spearmen, poured arrows into the Japanese ranks with mechanical efficiency. Their shorter composite bows might lack the range of Japanese Yumi, but they fired faster and in greater numbers. Even more terrifying were the explosive devices that the Mongols employed. These ceramic spheres, packed with gunpowder and shrapnel, exploded with deafening crashes that sent horses rearing in terror and left samurai temporarily deaf and disoriented. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. Warriors who had faced sword and spear without flinching found their courage tested by weapons that seemed to harness supernatural forces. The fighting raged throughout the day, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Mongols succeeded in establishing beachheads and pushing inland, but their advance was slow and costly. Every hill became a battleground, every village a fortress. The samurai, adapting quickly to their enemy's tactics, began to coordinate their own responses, abandoning individual heroics for group actions that could counter Mongol formations. As darkness fell on that first day of battle, both armies were exhausted and bloodied. The Mongols had gained ground, but at a higher cost than they had anticipated. The Japanese had given ground, but had not broken, and their resistance had grown more organized and effective as the day progressed. The invaders found themselves holding precarious positions in hostile territory, far from their ships and supply lines, facing an enemy that showed no signs of surrendering. Then nature itself entered the battle. Storm clouds that had been building on the horizon throughout the day began to unleash their fury. Wind howled across the exposed beaches where the Mongol fleet lay anchored. Waves that had lapped gently at the hulls in the morning grew into towering walls of water that smashed ships against each other and drove others onto the rocky shore. The typhoon that struck that night was not the legendary kamikaze that would destroy the second invasion, but it was devastating enough. Ships were wrecked, supplies lost, and men drowned in the churning waters. The Mongol commanders, faced with the prospect of being stranded in enemy territory with damaged ships and depleted supplies, made the decision to withdraw. The first invasion was over, but both sides knew it was merely a prelude to something far greater. As the battered remains of the Mongol fleet limped back across the sea, they left behind more than just the wreckage of ships and the bodies of the fallen. They had introduced Japan to a new kind of warfare, one that would force the samurai to evolve or perish. The lessons learned on the beaches of Hakata Bay would prove invaluable, for Kublai Khan was already planning his return, and next time he would come with forces that would dwarf the first invasion. The humiliation of retreat burned in Kublai Khan's mind like a brand. Never before had the Mongol war machine suffered such a setback. The great Khan, ruler of the largest empire in history, had been denied by a collection of islands and their stubborn warriors. But if the first invasion had been a test of Japanese resolve, the second would be a demonstration of Mongol fury unleashed without restraint. For 7 years, the machinery of empire ground into motion with a single purpose. Shipyards from Korea to southern China rang with the sound of hammers and saws as thousands of vessels took shape. Armories worked day and night forging weapons and armor for the greatest naval invasion the world had ever seen. Granaries emptied their stores to feed an army that would dwarf the first expedition. This time, there would be no half measures, no retreat, no mercy. The scale of preparation was staggering even by Mongol standards. 2 separate fleets would converge on Japan from different directions, making escape or reinforcement impossible for the defenders. The Korean fleet would carry 40,000 seasoned warriors, while the Southern Armada would transport over 100,000 men. Combined, this force represented nearly every ship the Empire could muster, every soldier it could spare, every weapon it could forge. Meanwhile, across the waters that had protected them for so long, the Japanese were not idle. The first invasion had shattered their illusions about Mongol intentions. There would be no negotiation, no accommodation, no peaceful resolution. The next attack would be total war, and Japan's very survival hung in the balance. The aftermath of 1274 had sparked a revolution in Japanese military thinking. The old ways of individual combat and personal glory had proven inadequate against coordinated enemy tactics. New strategies were needed, new fortifications, new ways of organizing their forces. The samurai, who had always prided themselves on facing any foe in open battle, now swallowed their pride and began building walls. The great stone barrier that rose along Hakata Bay was a marvel of medieval engineering. Stretching for miles along the coastline, it stood nearly 10 feet high in places, its seaward face a sheer wall of fitted stones that would deny landing craft easy access to the beaches. Behind the wall, defenders could move unseen, concentrating their forces at threatened points while remaining protected from enemy arrows and explosive devices. But the wall was more than just stone and mortar. It represented a fundamental shift in how Japan viewed warfare and defense. The samurai, whose ancestors had scorned fortifications as the refuge of cowards, now labored alongside peasants and craftsmen to build barriers that would protect their homeland. Traditional notions of honor were being tempered by the harsh realities of facing an enemy that fought by different rules. The construction effort mobilized the entire population of Kyushu. Every able-bodied man contributed labor, while women and children gathered stones and mixed mortar. Buddhist monasteries opened their treasuries to fund the work, while Shinto priests blessed the stones and prayed for divine protection. The wall became a symbol of national unity, a physical manifestation of Japanese determination to resist conquest. Beyond the Great Barrier, other preparations transformed the landscape of potential battle. Wooden stakes were driven into the muddy bottoms of harbors and river mouths, creating underwater obstacles that would hole enemy ships or force them into killing zones swept by archer fire. Signal fires were positioned on hilltops, ready to carry word of enemy movements faster than any messenger could ride. Weapons stockpiles were hidden in caves and temples, ensuring that resistance could continue even if main defensive positions fell. The samurai themselves underwent their own transformation. Traditional archery training expanded to include new techniques learned from captured Mongol equipment. Swordsmiths experimented with blade designs that could better penetrate foreign armor. Most importantly, warriors who had always fought as individuals began training in group formations, learning to coordinate their movements and support each other in battle. Young samurai who had missed the first invasion trained with desperate intensity, knowing their skills might soon be tested against the most formidable army in the world. Veterans of the earlier fighting shared their hard-won knowledge about Mongol tactics and weaknesses. Stories spread of enemy soldiers who panicked when cut off from their formations, of foreign horses that struggled with Japan's mountainous terrain, of weapons that failed in heavy rain or humid conditions. Religious fervor swept across the islands as the threat grew more imminent. Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines became centers of prayer and preparation. Monks who had devoted their lives to peaceful contemplation took up arms alongside the warriors. The very gods seemed to be preparing for war, with priests reporting visions and omens that spoke of coming divine intervention. The psychological atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation. Every fishing boat returning from sea was watched for signs that enemy scouts had been sighted. Every strange cloud formation was scrutinized for hints of approaching fleets. Children played war games with Mongol villains, while adults sharpened weapons and checked armor with obsessive care. As 1281 dawned, intelligence reports began filtering back from Korean merchants and Chinese refugees. Vast armadas were assembling, larger than anything previously imagined. Shipbuilders were working around the clock to complete vessels for the invasion fleet. Soldiers from across the Mongol Empire were converging on staging areas. The storm was about to break, and this time it would be a hurricane. The first fleet appeared on the horizon in May, emerging from the morning mist like a floating city. Korean vessels packed with warriors and siege engines approached the familiar waters of Hakata Bay, but the defenders who awaited them were no longer the same men who had fought 7 years earlier. These were soldiers hardened by years of preparation, protected by formidable fortifications, and united by a determination that had only grown stronger with time. The Mongol commanders surveyed the transformed coastline with growing unease. Where once they had faced scattered defenders on open beaches, now they confronted an unbroken wall of stone and timber, bristling with spear points and arrow slits. The easy landing sites of the first invasion had been transformed into killing grounds where their ships would be trapped against obstacles, while defenders rained death from protected positions. Probing attacks against the wall met with fierce resistance that cost far more than it gained. Japanese archers, shooting from covered positions, picked off landing parties with devastating accuracy. Small boats filled with samurai launched surprise raids against ships anchored too close to shore, boarding in the darkness and setting fire to sails and rigging before vanishing back into the night like maritime ghosts. The stalemate stretched into weeks, then months. The Great Southern Fleet finally arrived in August, joining its Korean counterpart in the largest naval formation ever assembled for invasion. Over 4,000 ships crowded the waters off Kyushu, their crews and passengers numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The sight was awesome and terrifying, a demonstration of imperial power that should have broken enemy morale simply by existing. Yet the wall held, and behind it, the defenders waited with patience born of desperation. They had learned that time was their ally, that every day the invasion fleet remained at sea was another day closer to the typhoon season. Weather that had once seemed like random misfortune now appeared to be a weapon that could be wielded by those who understood its patterns. The Mongol position grew more precarious with each passing day. Ships crowded together in hostile waters were vulnerable to fire attacks and sudden storms. Supplies intended for a quick campaign were running low after months at sea. Disease began spreading through the overcrowded vessels, weakening the invasion force even as it remained impressive in numbers. Most critically, the weather was changing. Storm clouds gathered more frequently on the horizon, and old sailors among both fleets recognized the signs of approaching typhoon season. The Mongol commanders faced an impossible choice: launch a costly assault against prepared positions, or remain at sea facing the growing threat of natural disaster. The decision was made for them by nature herself. On the night of August 15th, the wind began to rise with ominous intensity. What started as a stiff breeze quickly became a howling gale that sent smaller vessels scurrying for shelter. By dawn, the sea had transformed into a churning cauldron of white foam and towering waves that smashed ships together like toys in a bathtub. The Kamikaze had arrived, and with it, the destruction of Mongol dreams of conquest. Ships that had survived months at sea were reduced to splinters in hours. Warriors who had conquered half the world drowned in waters they had crossed to claim as their own. The divine wind had spoken, and its message was unmistakable. Japan would remain free. As the storm raged through the night, Japanese defenders watched from their wall as the greatest invasion fleet in history disintegrated before their eyes. Some would later claim they could walk from ship to ship across the wreckage that choked Hakata Bay. The few Mongol survivors who struggled ashore faced samurai who showed them no mercy. The second invasion was ending not in conquest, but in catastrophe that would echo through the centuries. When the morning sun finally pierced the storm clouds that had shrouded Hakata Bay, it revealed a scene of devastation that would be remembered for 800 years. The wreckage of what had once been the mightiest invasion fleet in history lay scattered across the waters like broken dreams. Timber and canvas, armor and weapons, the bodies of warriors who had conquered continents, all mixed together in a grotesque testament to the fury of the divine wind. The Mongol Empire, which had seemed unstoppable, had met its match not just in samurai steel, but in the very forces of nature that protected Japan's shores. Kublai Khan's dreams of universal conquest died in those churning waters, and with them, the myth of Mongol invincibility. Never again would the great empire attempt such an ambitious overseas campaign. But this story is about more than military failure or natural disaster. It's about the collision of two worlds, the meeting of land-based imperial ambition with island determination, of technological superiority with cultural resilience. The samurai who stood behind their stone walls that morning had been forever changed by their ordeal. They had learned to adapt, to build defenses, to fight as units rather than individuals. Japan itself had been transformed from a collection of competing clans into a unified nation forged in the crucible of foreign invasion. The kamikaze became more than just storms. They became symbols of divine protection, proof that Japan was special, chosen by the gods themselves for protection. This belief would echo through Japanese culture for centuries, shaping everything from military doctrine to national identity. The divine wind had not just saved Japan from conquest, it had given birth to a legend that would define an entire civilization. So the next time you hear the word kamikaze, remember this. Remember the stone walls of Hakata Bay, the courage of samurai who adapted their ancient ways to face a new kind of war, and the storms that scattered the dreams of empire across the bottom of the sea. Some forces, no matter how mighty, cannot overcome the combined power of human determination and nature's wrath.